Both Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehab Act require covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified people with epilepsy. There are three categories of reasonable accommodations. First, an employer may need to make changes to the application or interview process to make it accessible. For example, this may require that the interview be held in a physically accessible location for a person who uses a wheelchair, allow a service dog to accompany the applicant, provide a sign language interpreter for effective communication, or ensure that its online application process is fully accessible to blind and low vision and deaf and hard of hearing applicants. Next, employers may be required to make changes that enable people with epilepsy to have equal benefits and privileges of employment. For example, if the employer offers training, it cannot deny training to an employee with epilepsy because the employee cannot drive to the training site. Or, an employer cannot exclude an employee with epilepsy from the year-end award ceremony because it is being held in a location with multiple flashing lights that may be a seizure trigger. In that case, the employer must select a venue that works for all employees. Employers must also offer equal benefit packages in terms of insurance and leave policies. And finally, the majority of reasonable accommodations involve changes to the work environment that enable a person with epilepsy to perform the essential or major parts of the job. These kinds of changes could include altering a start time to allow an employee to come to work later or leave earlier to enable the employee to adjust to a change in medication. This request may be temporary or permanent. Allowing an employee to work a steady shift instead of having to alternate between days, mid-shift, and midnight shift when this type of accommodation is required to ensure proper sleep. Identifying a safe location for the employee to go if they feel a seizure coming on and allowing them to rest and recover. For many persons with epilepsy, this is greatly preferable to being transported by ambulance. Restructuring a job on a temporary or permanent basis. For example, if two people drive to a job site and take turns driving, and the employee with epilepsy loses their license temporarily because they have had a seizure, it would be reasonable for the employee to ask that his coworker pick up the driving duties until the employee's license is restored. A commonly requested accommodation is providing additional leave time for epilepsy-related reasons. This may include unpaid leave beyond what the employer already provides and intermittent unscheduled leave. There are a few things that ADA does not consider as a reasonable accommodation. Employers do not have to remove a major part of the job, lower a production standard, or change a person's supervisor or foreman. Courts usually rule that a reasonable accommodation should be granted unless it poses an undue financial hardship or a disruption of the business. In most cases, the request for the reasonable accommodation should come from the employee. Every workplace is different, but typically, the employee makes the request to the supervisor, foreman, or to human resources. The request does not have to be in writing, but your employer may give you some paperwork to fill out to document the request. The employer can ask, if not obvious, for documentation both about the employee's epilepsy and why the accommodation is needed. Employers are only allowed to ask for documentation related to the specific request you are making. The employer cannot ask you to sign a waiver to provide access to all of your medical records. The ADA requires that all medical documentation and other information related to the reasonable accommodation request be kept confidential and in files separate from regular personnel files. Although there are no specific timelines for the employer to get back to you about your request, they should respond promptly so the conversation can continue, a decision can be made, and the accommodation can be put in place. The employer does not have to grant the exact accommodation you ask for, but the accommodation does need to be effective and allow you to continue working. So the key points to remember about reasonable accommodation for persons with epilepsy are: an employer may need to make a change to the application or interview process to make it accessible. Employers may be required to make changes that enable people with epilepsy to have equal benefits and privileges of employment. A commonly requested accommodation is leave time for epilepsy-related reasons. And the request for the reasonable accommodation should come from the employee. The Epilepsy Foundation has 2 documents that can help you with an accommodation request. The first describes your legal rights in the workplace under the ADA as a person with a seizure disorder or epilepsy. The second document is targeted to doctors and describes how to help patients with epilepsy and seizure disorders who need a reasonable accommodation. You can take this document to your doctor to identify what kinds of documentation you will need to provide to your employer. Visit epilepsy.com to download these documents or to find out more about reasonable accommodations in the workplace.